Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If I can have your attention. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start with the proceedings for the morning. So if you can kindly grab your seats. Fantastic. Welcome to the 2024 budget speech analysis brought to you by RMB in partnership with the Sunday Times. My name is Nastasia Arendse, and I will be your host and moderator for the rest of the session. Not only do we have an audience that's here with us, but we also have a virtual audience. So a warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us. So over the next couple of hours, we're going to be unpacking the budget. We've heard it yesterday, you've looked at the documents. So this is the opportunity where we will have roving mics and you can ask the minister and various members who are going to be on the panel a little bit later on your questions. But I also want to encourage those of you who are watching online, there is a facility where you'll be able to type out your question and we'll try to get through all of those questions. We are honored this morning to have Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana amongst us to deliver the keynote speech. So, Minister, thank you. We know that you are wanted in different places, especially post the budget. So thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. So as I mentioned, we're going to have a panel discussion. So in this panel discussion, we're going to be discussing, obviously, the budget, but we'll also look at the challenges, the opportunities, the prospects for South Africa. And the panel discussion is going to be made up of the minister himself. We'll have a tax expert. We do have the chief economist at RMB, Isaah Mhlanga, who is going to be here. And like I said, we've had time, a few hours to digest this budget. So I do look forward to getting those questions and those interactions from you as the audience. Without wasting any time, we're going to get the show on the road, and to officially welcome you, I'd like to welcome on stage RMB CEO Emery Brown.
Thank you, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, both everyone here in person and those people online. It is our absolute pleasure to be hosting this wonderful event here at our Portside offices this morning. First off, I want to extend a very warm welcome to our Finance Minister and keynote speaker for today, Mr Enoch Godongwana, and then also the DG for National Treasury, Dr. Duncan Peterser. Gentlemen, we are very aware that the demands on your time are extensive, and we know that the budget speech yesterday was the culmination of months of hard work at National Treasury in a very difficult economic environment, both locally and globally. So we are honored and deeply grateful that both of you, together with your colleagues from National Treasury that are joining you, have chosen to spend this morning with us. I then also want to welcome our co-hosts of this event, the Business Times editor, Caiphus Khosana, and columnist Sam Mkokeli. Gentlemen, thank you for your partnership and for your presence. Your insights on our country's economy always provide a unique angle to our conversations. As our lovely MC has said, we have quite a dream team panel discussion this morning, and Itireleng, Kubeka, she is the Deloitte's Africa MD for Tax and Legal. Thank you for joining us. And panelists, I'm sure we all look forward to a captivating discussion. Then last, but definitely not least, a special welcome to our clients, both those here in person and online. We are deeply grateful for your partnership with us, where jointly we can change lives and we can have a positive impact on our country. We look forward to deepening our valued relationship with all of you. At RMB, we are confident that the possibilities offered by South Africa and the rest of the continent will continue to draw investors to Africa due to the vast and diverse potential that our continent offers. Yes, our continent and our country has its challenges, but challenges create massive opportunities. And RMB's extensive experience on the continent means that we can combine our expertise on the ground across sectors and regulatory environments with the skills in the broader FirstRand Group to deliver tailored solutions to our clients to unlock those opportunities. We also firmly believe that the private sector has a critical role to play in building a healthy society. And as a key role player, that we can collaborate with the public sector so that we can find and fund solutions to our societal, economic, and environmental challenges. This speaks to our RMB purpose, which is to empower our people and our clients to be exceptional together so that all our stakeholders, which includes our society and our country, can thrive. The former US President, Barack Obama, once said that a budget is about much more than a series of numbers on a page. It is an embodiment of our values. And I hope that I speak for everyone here today, that our values are aligned, and we are here to rally behind our common purpose, to see our beautiful country, South Africa, succeed. Enjoy your morning with us when we listen to the Minister, and I invite you to actively participate in the discussions and the debate that I'm confident today will produce. As we unpack the budget speech from yesterday and delve into the impact that this can have for our country, but also the rest of the continent's economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you for those welcome remarks. That is Amory. And should it mention that we've got a fantastic panel, but I'm going to make the panel even better. Can I tell you how I'm going to make it better? So he has politely agreed to also take questions from the audience, should there be questions, and that, of course, is our DG, Dr. Duncan Peterson. So thank you so much. I do know that you said that you want to be right in front, so we'll have you there. I'm not going to take you out of your comfort zone, but we will have a mic on standby, just in case there are questions that come through, both from the audience and online, that you can help tackle. So thank you so much for agreeing to do that for us. So we're now going to have the welcome address from the team at Sunday Times, and we're first going to hear from the Business Times editor, Kaifas Khosana. And when he's done with his welcome, we're going to be hearing from Sam Mgogeli. So I see Kaifas is walking towards us, so please, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Program Director. I'm here representing the editor of the Sunday Times, who couldn't be here, Mr. Msomi. I'd like to welcome everybody who's here, the Minister, the DG, the CEO of RMB, the Chief Economist, and everybody else. I see Fundo there, the Chief of Staff, and everybody else, and you distinguished guests. The Sunday Times is well, contrary to what you may have read or heard, we're still the most influential Sunday read. We're consumed both in print, we're consumed digitally. So on Sunday, you know, we're read by the person working on the street, the ordinary person on the street, and we're read by very influential people like yourselves. So whatever is said here, and whatever is discussed here, whatever is in the budget, the Think Budget event today, some of it will find itself on the pages of the Sunday Times. So, you know, we'll continue. We love, you know, being part of the national discourse of the country, you know, discussing issues and policies that affect this country, that shape this country going forward. So we're really privileged to be part of this event, and thank you very much.
The only bad thing about Caiaphas is that he supports Orlando Pirates. Trust him with journalism, but never with football. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sam Kokeli from Kokeli Advisory, just in case I forgot my name, so it had to be embedded in the company name. To the Minister, leadership team at RMB, Emery, DG, distinguished guests, panelists, wonderful to spend the morning with you today. I'm going to be very brief. I can't introduce the minister to you. He was well known to many people around South Africa and people who follow South Africa. He has been at the helm of thinking around the policy in South Africa for a long time. He's been a member of the National ANC's most senior body since 1997. You have to figure that 1997 is the stage that Nelson Mandela steps off the leadership of the ANC. Thabo Mbeki gets in there. There is a young man, Enoch Godongwana from Gala. He is among the people entrusted by the ANC with deep thinking. Former leftist, trade unionist, NUMSA. He was very red at the time. And then leader of the SACP, one of the people who really thought deeply about politics, the death of unions in South Africa, long before the unions actually thought that they could even die. So Mr. Godongwana has actually had very interesting portfolios within the ANC. Find him in unions, find him in the leadership of COSATU, you find him at the ANC. He had actually got to chair that powerful, or used to be powerful animal, the Economic Transformation Committee of the ANC. He's played roles in government, various roles, been with Team Finance for a very long time. When the Eastern Cape was a really bad government then, before the Eastern Cape expanded and replicated itself, that you could see how bad South Africa's government has become. You could see it from the Eastern Cape back then. The Eastern Cape government in the 90s struggled to pay off, to pass on money for employee benefits. It was robbing Peter to pay Paul. Things were so bad that Nelson Mandela thought in 1997 he would tap Enoch Godongwana to go to the Eastern Cape with Raymond Mhlaba to stabilize the government at the time. Being finance minister or MEC since 1997, became part of our Team Finance. He likes taking time. It took him a long time to actually finally get to the National Treasury, a couple of detours, Department of Public Enterprises, Department of Economic Development, and then here we have him now as our finance minister. He likes teasing me about a few things. He says my public debt is getting out of hand. And, so the first time I saw him, I probably weighed about 80 kgs. He says now, my public debt is ballooning. And I tell him, actually, it's a ratio. It's a function of poor growth. When you have no growth, your GDP numbers are bad, then your public debt starts looking very, very bad, which is the issue. Budget review has been amazing. Duncan, Peter C., the DG, page 77 is my favorite page. I'll be writing about it this weekend. Looking forward to more engagement around this. Thank you very much.
I do have a question for you, so I think the audience can hear, but you want to go to the mic? It's a quick one. I won't be long, I promise. I want to put Sam on the spot here because I love that he walked into it. So in your Sunday Times column this past weekend, it was titled, SA is heading straight for the IMF. But the title of the article is not what I want to talk to you about. In the first line of this article, you write, and I quote, "It's more banter than an exchange of information, but every time I see Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, I ask, how are you? It's a real concern, though." Close quotes. He's delivered this speech yesterday at 2 p.m. Are you still worried about him? Yes, no, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. I got surprised last night. I really didn't know he was 68. I thought maybe he was about 55. No, the Treasury actually, they've got the youngest technical team in the government. They are Tin Swallows. From the DG is just barely 40. The average age is 39. So you've got now this old man who's actually enjoying working with the youngest, the team in the ministry. They're barely 25. Then you start seeing the contrast. Like here's somebody, master's in financial economics, who works with the Duncan, DG, who's got a PhD. Have we seen his PhD, by the way?
Thank you so much. On that wonderful note, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've outlined many wonderful achievements from the minister, but we're going to hear from him in a bit. He's going to be delivering the keynote address. So without much further ado, Minister, please join us on stage.
Program Director, CEO of RMB, and distinguished guests. Mkhokeli now reminds me of a number of things. That when I was asked to go to the Eastern Cape, I was a member of the Communist Party Politburo. It's an interesting thing, and we hated what was called outsourcing. And I discovered that public works in the Eastern Cape were doing R72 from Port Alfred to East London. And the road was not being finished. They were not finishing the road at all. Because they live in Grahamstown, they come to R72 at about 10 a.m. When it's tea time, they've got to go to tea time. And at 11, they start working. At 12:30 is lunch. Come back at 1:30. 3 is tea time. They can't come back because they've got to clock out in Grahamstown. They're not finishing the road. I then said to Public Works, you're not getting the money until you outsource the road. Can you see the change in outlook, how practice changes, how you do things? But back on track to what we're doing today, I was not told that I'm going to do a keynote speech, which, don't fire me, Duncan, Cleo next to you. Cleo didn't do her job properly. They normally in Treasury want to make sure that when I make a speech, I stick to the text. If Duncan knew that I'm going to make a keynote speech, they would have made sure that there's a written speech and I stick to that text because they say I off-ramp too much. So the other thing, and you should have told me the time. Politicians, particularly closer to the elections, they're uncontrollable. Let me say, what did we say to you yesterday? We told you about what is happening in the global economy, and somebody was writing next to your article in Kogele, there was one by Chris Brown, where people were saying, why should we be told about what's happening in the global thing? These people must tell us they're not doing good work, that's all. How the economy is performing. But global economy impact on our own. We kind of gave you a brief of how that is panned out, largely from the IMF. And we told you how our economy is not working. And we're more modest. More modest. We didn't tell you that on average, since for a decade, the economy has been almost stagnant, growing at about 0.8%. with a population during the same period at about 1.5, 1.4. So what did I tell you? Per capita, we're becoming more and more poorer. We're kind of more or less, we didn't want to tell you everything about ourselves. I forgot, no, I normally forget Duncan that we never paparazzi here. So I forget when journalists are here, I tend to be too frank and honest sometimes. So that's the economy. Lastly is the, I asked we push the head of economic policy in Treasury. Can you guys run numbers for me? I've got a gut feel that the main contributor to this thing is electricity. The IMF, the World Bank has done a study which suggests that were it not for electricity, our economy in shape and size would be far better than it is today. So that's our problem number one, our constraint. Our constraint number two, which is new, is logistics. Logistics. Now, one of the things we should not do in dealing with the Transnet issue, we should not repeat the ESCOM template. It's a bad template. Because what we did in ESCOM, we put money into ESCOM right through, hoping that by fixing ESCOM, we'll fix the electricity problem. Instead of saying, let's fix the electricity problem at the same time as we're trying to fix ESCOM. How do you fix the electricity problem? Is to make sure that other people who can get capability to provide electricity can do so. It took us time to deregulate the generation sector and make sure that we can have electricity by other providers. Because the ESCOM problem is bigger than I think. Last year, ESCOM got an increase of 18.6 tariff. And Duncan was generous, he gave them 78 billion rand. In a series of bailouts. We did some numbers now to check how, from 2008, when ESCOM started the loads and the outages, how much, including all other institutions, how much we have lost in bailouts. Now, I told you I was a communist as well. I think my party as well, we still carry a baggage, a number of us, of thinking that everything must be done by the state. It's a problem. It's a problem. Spend more money trying to fix these things because we want the state to do things instead of getting people to do things in the country. So we've got that problem in the economy. Then it fits into the fiscal strategy. Fits into the fiscal strategy. Okay, there were other shocks, COVID-19 and other things. The debtors balloon, not by me, for God's sake, I've inherited it. When I joined, it was already at 4.5. When I joined government, it was already at 4.5. I was talking to Trevor Manuel last night. We said, you know, Minister of Finance, there's something called luck, because he had luck. ESCOM was working, Transnet was working, everything was, there was no state capture and other things. So he had sheer luck. And when he left, debt to GDP was 24%. When he left, he was lucky. So I'm trying to grapple with this debt now, which is ballooning. we have said our strategy is to make sure that by 25-26, its PIX is going to, at 75.3, it's going to come down. And how you manage that, you must make sure that you ensure your primary balances are correct. 23-24, despite the growth in the deficit from 4% to 4.9, we're beginning to achieve a primary balance. 23-24, we want to maintain that moving forward. So that's the story we're telling you. And the other story, we're to try and restructure three things, in my view. Eskom, Transnet, a third one is crime and corruption. You must see how we're directing resources in that direction. Crime and corruption. The question South Africans must ask is not whether the police have got money or not, is whether they are doing the job. They can't be complaining about resources. In addition to the money we're allocating via the budget, there's that act, what is it? In abbreviation, it's called CARA. The money, every money that comes for corruption and everything, whether is the ABB money will go out, whether is now that's going to come from SAP, about 2 billion is put into that account and is utilized for all the law enforcement agencies. We've given them about 2.9 billion from that account. The police alone have got 1.7 to deal with crime and corruption. Now the question is not for me, it's for Duncan to follow, is whether they're going to do the right thing. We get value for money from the police and the law enforcement agencies. They've got money. That's the direction. So key priorities is the crime and corruption, health, and education. You can see that's how we've directed the resources in that sense. The key question that you have got to ask, the controversial issue, is the JEFRA, the expert. I'll leave that to Duncan. By September, he had no clue how the JEFRA thing works. By February, he's the best expert. He has been working with every expert globally to try and figure out how does this thing work and how to mitigate risk and how do we do that. The battle was, should we put it into priority spending or should we put it into debt? Politicians were on the side of putting, we're going to an elections. Politicians were more, including myself, were tempted to think that we couldn't put into spending priorities. Duncan and his team drew a line and they defeated us. Can you see how democratic we are? They make the decisions and I become the spokesperson of those decisions. Lastly, that's how we've done. I don't want to mess up your program. I was asked to speak in Mzamba in an AFCOF conference. The people asked me to open for 10 minutes. I didn't look at it. I spoke for 1 hour, 10 minutes. So I don't want to do that tonight because we're still going to engage and we're going to sit here. Duncan will talk at length on JEFRA. If First Secretary, you would like Duncan to explain that better. And I made my time. I didn't want to listen to him because I spent money fighting with him on how to spend it than listening to him. And I lost that battle. We've got a good team. The key thing in working in Treasury as Minister of Finance is to harness the talent that's there in Treasury. If you harness that talent, you may be a dummy body, you will be a star. Because they do the right thing. They do the right thing. I'm proud to be working with that team. I fight with them. a great deal. They were telling me the other day, even the language I used because I'm under pressure from politicians. I come back and fight with them. They fight me. I go back there. They punch me. You know, that's how the budget process is. What is called the political economy of budgeting, because you get all of these problems. I'm going to enjoy. I'm going to be here and have nice discussions. But largely, the main focus was to stabilize grow the economy, stabilize debt, and deal with structural reforms. Those are key issues we're dealing with. Sustainable finances. We're on track. We're going to do that. We're going to do that. I was saying to Duncan, my little reading of the literature is that to do fiscal consolidation, do it as far away from the election as possible. If I come back, that's the time we've got to strengthen fiscal consolidation faster, so that by the year 26, 27, we're closing it. Far from the election, we can do any changes. The little thing people are going to say, are you trying to run an election budget? An election budget should have been last year, 23, 24. This budget can influence electoral outcomes. I've told even my colleagues who were saying, it's not an easy thing. Within my party, people were thinking that Treasury and myself are trying to undermine the ANC's electoral outcomes. I spent my whole adult life in the ANC for me to be told I'm undermining its electoral outcomes. But the key issue was we've got to do the right things. You can't change anything. It's not an election budget, this budget. I don't want people to bother and ask that question. Not at all. Not at all. We can't influence an election with a budget in 2 months. And that's, thank you.
Thank you so much. But the reason actually came onto stage, outside of the fact that I need to welcome the next panel, the one thing we didn't tell the audience is that because Duncan is the JEFRA expert, at the end of the event there's going to be a test to see who was paying attention to when Duncan was explaining. That's the thing. And you get to mark it. Minister, please join us on stage. Have a seat. Yes, please.
I must take my notebook.
Okay, we can.
Oh, it's my panel. It's just going to bring it with me.
There we go. Teamwork makes the dream work, so let's do that. Thank you. Here are your notes. If there's anything else, you will let me know.
No.
So we're going to get into the panel discussion. The minister has said quite a lot. And judging by what you've said, the audience online didn't waste any time because there are like more than 10 questions that have already come through in the past few minutes that you've been on stage. So once again, I do want to encourage those in the audience with us, please take the opportunity. You've heard what the minister said, but we're going to unpack a whole lot more during that panel discussion. So if there's anything that comes to mind or there's a question, please use the opportunity. I'd like to welcome on stage, as we start that panel discussion, Isaah Mhlanga, the Chief Economist at RMB, if you can join us. Next to him will be Itireleng Kubeka, who's the Managing Director for Tax and Legal at Deloitte Africa. And he's sort of part of the panel, but not really part of the panel, but we'll pretend he's part of the panel even though he's sitting over there. That is the National Treasury Director General, Dr. Duncan Peterson, who, like I said, is part of the panel, but not really, but he's there on standby just in case you have any questions for him. So for the interest of time, I'm not going to do any opening remarks. I'm going to get into the meat of the conversation because I want to leave as much time for audience interaction and questions, because at the end of the day, as much as it's about my questions, it's also about you, the audience, being able to engage in the minister so that we have these conversations on an ongoing basis. And the one thing we generally do at the end of the budget presentation, various media houses will say, well, rate the budget out of 10. They'll speak to various experts and they'll give a number and give an explanation. So I'm going to do something similar, but I'm going to flip it around a little bit. I'm going to give the minister an opportunity to rate his own budget out of 10. Well, not his, but let's call it the team budget. Out of 10, what figure would you give it?
I'm probably subjective, so I'm probably subjective. Should I give ourselves 8?
An 8? Would you agree, Duncan? Okay. 8 out of 10. Okay. So let's get into it. We've heard your remarks, but I'm curious to hear the remarks from the rest of your panel members. Isaah, let's start off with you. You got all the details, you heard the speech. What were the key takeaways for you?
Thank you very much. Perhaps to start with, it's quite evident Treasury looks at the numbers and they do the right thing. They don't follow politics. Politicians would have given themselves 10 out of 10. So, as far as the budget is concerned, I think it's quite clear what Treasury tried to do. Obviously, the surprise was JEFRA. We have been talking to clients offshore, locally, and trying to figure out when JEFRA was going to be tapped into. The second question was how big the quantum of what Treasury was going to tap into. So that was a surprise. 150 billion is quite substantial. The intention is quite clear from the budget that it's to reduce debt service costs, which is the right thing to do. The other option would have been to use that to solve our infrastructure problems, but you can't get an immediate benefit out of growth because it takes time to lift economic growth. So it's a sensible thing to reduce debt service cost. We didn't hear much about SOE bailouts, which is what Treasury has committed to in the previous budgets, to say we will not continue to bail out state-owned companies. If we provide funding, we're going to put conditions. And it's quite positive to see that those conditions were affirmed. I was speaking to some of the Treasury colleagues yesterday after the budget, and they did highlight that they actually took some money from ESCOM because they didn't meet certain conditions, which is something that we didn't pick up in the budget. So to really stick to what you promise you are going to do as far as the use of funding, it builds confidence. So overall, I would give the budget 7 out of 10, not because Treasury didn't do what they're supposed to. It's because of the constraints that lie outside of what they can do. They can manage the funding, but they can't build railway lines. They can't build power stations. They can't build hospitals. So that is outside of what National Treasury can do. All we would expect is to follow through on how the funding is used by SOEs to make sure that the structural reforms are implemented, to squeeze as much as you can out of the politicians to do their part in making sure the right policies are in place, but also the right spending is done, which I think was done.
Itireleng, let's come to you, your key takeaways as well as that rating at the end.
Thanks, Nastasia. So, I mean, the minister had a lot to tackle, as already mentioned. This is probably one of the most difficult budgets we've had to tackle as a country. And taking into account that this is also election year, we knew not to expect too much, because generally that is the trend. But I think looking at, the JEFRA, as Isaah has mentioned, was definitely the surprise. So that is the new acronym for all of us to learn, and the new word to be speaking out there more often. And then the NEV, the new energy that was expected from our side, we did predict that. We did expect at some point the 15% global minimum, which we know in our world as Pillar 2, that was expected. Everything else was, and then there's other smaller taxes that were changes that were welcome. But just very similar to Isaah, I mean, given what the minister had to tackle with, I think as a taxpayer, there was a lot of expectations, but with very limited resources to have to make decisions on. So I would probably go for about a 6 out of 10.
6, okay. So one of the reasons I asked them to give a rating is that as we get the answers and we start talking amongst each other and answering questions, I'm going to come back to their rating as to whether they still stick with that 7 out of 10 and that 6 out of 10, or you're willing to move it either up or down, including the minister himself, if he still believes that the team, it was an 8 out of 10, or if he's willing to bring it lower or higher. 10 out of 10, I don't know, but maybe not a 10 out of 10. That might be a bit too much. But Minister, let me come to you here, because in the lead up to every budget, whether you look at whatever newspaper headlines, the nuance or some of the tropes that are thrown out there is that this is going to be the most difficult budget. The minister is on a tough balancing act, walking a tightrope, and various other things. In the lead up to this one, does it get difficult each year, or do you believe that each budget becomes difficult based on external circumstances and some of the internal things happening within the economy?
No, this year was a bit tough. When I came in, I had the benefit of the commodity boom to some extent. And 2021-22, we came with a 200 billion rand revenue barrel. So nice things we could find, all the SRDs and other things. As we entered the 23-24 financial year, things became tough. One of the things we didn't have money for was the SRD. 36 billion. First quarter 2023, revenue shortfall. Intensive load shedding, Transnet logistics. I'll just give you an example. I'm told by the mining industry that the last time they were below 60 or so tons, 60 million tons per annum on Richards Bay was in 1996. Right through there with about 77 million tons. Last year, it was below 50, it's about 40-something million tons. Now, what that tells you is that the revenue loss was massive for us in that first quarter. So we're coming to this financial year already. You will see we make the point that the revenue shortfall was about 56 billion rand. We're already entering this year from a tough opposition. That's why in the medium-term budget policy, we had to make certain massive adjustment and budget cuts. So we entered this planning for this budget. We're in that very difficult environment. That's why Itireleng must understand the terrain environment. And
It's still early. She might change that rating a little bit higher. But
the terrain was difficult.
yes.
Difficult. Yeah.
I want to come back to that terrain, and at this point, I will actually rope in Duncan here so he can probably walk us through some bits of that terrain. But let me come to you, Isaah. We've seen the economic growth forecasts. Are they in line with what you're thinking for the year ahead? And do you believe that there are risks that could perhaps move those forecasts to the downside? What are those risks for you?
They are in line with our expectations. The good thing is Treasury uses the same numbers we use. They don't have, to a large extent, outside of public sector data. Data is very transparent, which is a good thing. So growth expectations of 1.2, 1.3, if you look at consensus, Treasury is 1.3 for this year. Over the next 2 years, you could say an average of 1.6, 1.7. It's a plausible expectations. which is one of the big change that we saw over the last 3 years, where Treasury's forecast has been much more realistic as compared to the decade 2019, where forecast tended to be over-optimistic, resulting in over-budgeting, and following that, spending would continue to balloon. So realistic forecasts. The risks, obviously, are the things that the minister spoke about. It's your logistics. If we continue to have the issues that we have with Transnet, that hampers the mining sector's production. It's, again, load shedding. At least we have had significant investments by private companies with the incentive that was provided to invest in solar energy. It does mitigate, but it doesn't solve for base load. That remains a big risk. Globally, we don't know what's going to happen with the US elections. Given how government has communicated its foreign policy, we don't know how Donald Trump 2.0 is going to respond to that. That's a potential risk from a trade perspective. The Middle East issues continue to be a risk as well. These are the things that we know.
Yes.
But there are also things that we might not know that might come either because of decisions that we don't implement. I have to say, the one other thing that is in the budget, which is sneaked through, but not explicitly, have to do with an unallocated spending that looks like 2 years more of an SRD grant beyond March 2025. Maybe we can get a little bit of an explanation, because then the quantums just looks like it's an SRD grant. But we can hear National Treasury's response on as far as that is concerned.
Okay. Duncan, let me bring you into the conversation. And he's pointing at you, so you might have to answer this one. So let's talk about, we'll get to the SRD grant, but let's talk about JEFRA, because there have been a lot of questions that have actually come in relation to that. But also what I found quite interesting, looking at media reports, now that the announcement has been made, there seems to be a misunderstanding of what JEFRA actually is, the risks and all of that. So perhaps you can bring us into your confidence here. When did the conversations with the Reserve Bank start? Why now? And how does all of this work?
No. On now? Yes. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Anastasia, for the question. My wife called me this morning and said, I've been listening to the budget coverage. Can you please explain JEFRA a bit more simply than you currently do? And I said, good morning, my love. Did you sleep well? So let me see if I can do a better job than I have been doing. When did the conversation start? The conversation started in the first half of last year. And the conversation started where they are supposed to start, which is at the something called the Standing Committee on Banking and Financial Markets, which is a committee that is a joint committee between the Reserve Bank and the National Treasury. And I served on that committee in my capacity as the head of ALM, Asset and Liability Management at the National Treasury, where things like financial market, banking issues, funding strategy, financial stability, and so on are discussed between ourselves and the Reserve Bank. So that was in the first half of last year, and we then started that discussion there with technical inputs from the Reserve Bank and technical inputs from ourselves. At that point, we also agreed that given the complexity of this issue, that we would pull in a team from the IMF's Capital Markets Division to have a look at this and have a look at, in particular, global best practice and how other countries manage this. And we've been working on this issue in collaboration with the Reserve Bank since then. I think the starting point is to acknowledge that JEFRA, which is the point the governor also made yesterday, is a very unusual arrangement. Other countries typically manage valuation profits and losses on their foreign reserves very differently. And so the first point to make about this reform is that we are aligning ourselves more with our peers in terms of how these things are managed, and that's why we felt confident that we could go ahead with it. So that's issue number one. I think issue number two is that we've had these, the Reserve Bank has foreign exchange reserves, which they hold in a number of hard currencies, the dollar amongst them, but they also have some gold reserves. And what happens is that if you buy those reserves at 10 Rand to the dollar, because you have to purchase them with rands, and then the dollar strengthens against the rand over time, or the rand depreciates against the dollar over time, what happens steadily is that the value of those reserves in rand terms increases. Now, where we are unusual is that we have a special account where those valuation gains are kept. But it's not always the case that these are valuation gains. In fact, and the point we make in the book, in 2003, we actually had to pay the Reserve Bank 28 billion because the currency had strengthened against the dollar. But what had happened since then is you had a steady depreciation of the currency, and the valuation benefits that are sitting in this account is now 506 billion. And so what we've done is we've implemented a new settlement methodology that allows us to, in effect, monetize some of these gains in two ways. Number one, we are putting 150 billion into the fiscal framework to finance the gross borrowing requirement over the next 3 years. So to the minister's point, we are using it to reduce our borrowing requirement and therefore saving about 30 billion in debt service costs over the next 3 years. And then the other part is we are using 100 billion of those funds in order to strengthen the contingency reserves of the Reserve Bank in order to protect their solvency, given that these are valuation benefits. So we're doing it in two ways. We are keeping a buffer to protect us against future changes in the currency. We are strengthening the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank, and we are using the final portion, therefore, in order to bring down our borrowing requirement and therefore our debt service costs and our debt stock over time.
As a follow-up question, and I'm sure there are others who have questions in relation to JEFRA, one of the other, sort of news flow, written articles has been that this could possibly be a slippery slope if not traversed, properly, being able to, tap into this. Do you see that as a concern that it could be a slippery slope?
I think the way we try to manage that is to make sure that whatever we do on JEFRA follows a number of very key principles, which we've outlined in the budget review. Number one, there has to be a settlement arrangement that is agreed upon between the Minister of Finance and the Governor that puts in place the institutional mechanisms for how this is going to work. So whether you have a different governor or a different minister or a different team at the Treasury, the institutional arrangements are in place that govern this. And the institutional arrangements will ensure that the solvency of the bank is never compromised or at risk, and that the balances in the account can never be reversed by exchange rate appreciation. There are other principles that we've thought about as well, such as the fact that we are never going to sell reserves in order to monetize JEFRA. We are always going to do it in the way that we have done, which is we use the valuation benefits in order to inject liquidity. So we think the combination of having the right institutional arrangements so that you have that certainty, as well as being very clear about the principles that govern how this is going to be executed over time, protects against that risk.
Okay, so we're going to pause that there, and there are other questions that have come in.
Can we deal with the, what he calls something that is sneaked in? Look, when last year agreed on the extension of the grant to 2025, it became clear to us that people may say, but how sure are you that in 2025 is going to come to an end? Otherwise, your story is not credible. We then said, we need to pencil something moving forward to make sure that you're spotted right, to pencil something moving. So in case there's going to be a continuation of the extension, to make the budget credible. You must have noticed that in the State of the Nation address, the President said it's going to be extended, and not only extended, but improved. That's what he said in the State of the Nation, and he repeated it when he closed the debate. So clearly, from our side, we've got to safeguard ourselves and not be caught in an environment where we've not made provision, and we don't think it's going to be an easy call to, I don't know, DG, whether I don't think it's going to be an easy call to simply say we're going to do away with the grant in this environment. So you are right.
Oh, okay. On that, I want to stay with that because in the speech you mentioned work is currently underway to improve it, as you mentioned, by April of this year, and that you plan to, there is work that is being done with the Department of Social Development. Building on what you've just said then, what is your thinking then around the social, the SRD grant going forward?
Look, there are a number of issues. From a Treasury perspective, we would like to see the grant coming to an end in March 2025. That's our wish. We had an interesting debate with my DG. I said, we must distinguish between our wish and reality. Reality is that there's a lot of movement, social, particularly NGO movement, which is campaigning for what they call basic income grant. And that thing is appealing in a number of appealing to a number of political parties and politicians. Now, that's where your difficulty is that there's that movement. We've got to say, our view is that given the fiscal space and the demands for health, for everything else, if you continue with it, you may have to find a new source of revenue, which means taxing. But there's a debate about NHI, which may also require a new form of taxing. And there's a limit in how far you can tax people, and so on. So we disagree with a number of people on some of these things, but as I'm saying, we're walking that tightrope.
Itireleng, let me come to you here because building on what the minister just said, saying that there is a limit in how far you can tax people, briefly give me a sense of the local tax landscape and then perhaps adding on to that, the impact of not adjusting the tax brackets for inflation.
Sure, thanks. So the minister's right. I think we have been squeezed in all sorts of forms. All sorts of taxes are potentially at their maximum as far as they can go. And even not adjusting the tax brackets is in itself a further squeeze because there isn't an inflationary increase. So you receive an inflationary increase, but it does not mean much. In some cases, you're potentially worse off. And that forces the government to think very creatively about how do you collect differently. And hence, the Revenue Service has to look at how do they widen the tax base, how do they improve compliance, how do they use technology for administrative efficiency. And that's where they really have to focus because there isn't much more you can really squeeze. And even looking at the 15% minimum global tax, then in itself will require corporates to invest in technology, in systems to be able to comply with that. So that's even further squeezing a place that's already completely out. So it's not an easy space to be in. It's definitely a very difficult situation we're in, and hence creativity is required here from all sides, because we're in a very tight spot. And potentially that's why there wasn't much mention around NHI, because some kind of funding has to come from somewhere. So where do you get it from? At this, given where we are at the moment, it's a very difficult space to be in.
I'll get to the NHI in a bit, but let's focus on that global minimum corporate tax of 15%. For those who may not understand, because what Sam mentioned when he was doing his welcome address is that a lot of what is going to be discussed here is going to find itself in the newspapers. We do have media colleagues who are here. So not only are we speaking to people who are in this room and online, but we're also speaking to somebody in the street who's going to grab that newspaper article and try to understand the lay of the land.
Yes.
When we talk about this global minimum corporate tax of 15%, how should we view it, and perhaps the aim from a tax perspective?
So this came from the OECD in trying to help prevent tax-based erosion, especially in the lower income tax jurisdictions, where multinationals are seen to be transporting their funds into that space. And so what this does is that it forces all jurisdictions to pay a minimum tax, and that tax will be paid in that jurisdiction. And the difficulty with this is that it's not as simple as it sounds, that, okay, everybody pay minimum 15% tax, because if you think about it, jurisdictions all have their own tax laws. So you almost have to find a way of how do you compare apples to apples in levying this 15% minimum tax. So if you think about it, how do you make an apple sitting in the UK look like an apple sitting in South Africa, knowing that they're not getting the same sun, the same water, the same ground to grow on, you know? So it's a very complex, it's an extremely complex tax. And being in an environment where I've got exposure to how it's been implemented in other jurisdictions, I know how complex it is. So it's not as simple as it sounds, that it is just easy 15% and just levy it. So it's going to, the devil is going to be in the detail. We do have legislation that does already try and cater for ensuring that there is, to minimize tax-based erosion. So we'll see how it works hand in hand with this minimum tax. And I know that the minister is expecting to raise about 8 billion from this in the years 25 and 26 going forward. So, but that will really depend on the legislation.
Isaah, thoughts?
It's clear that for Treasury, you have to get all the tax revenues that you can from all sources. But it's also clear that in terms of the funding strategy, it has been changing over time, where we saw significant issuance of T-bills relative to long-term bonds. It's pressure because it's too expensive to issue on the long end. That's very clear. There is only so much that can be done from a tax perspective in terms of increasing revenue in an economy that is not growing. So there are limits to that. But on the other hand, if you look from an expenditure perspective, we don't seem to be controlling spending tightly enough to make sure that we reduce that base spending. Case in point, the DG says there is a 30 billion savings from a reduced borrowing costs because of the use of JEFRA. On the other hand, we now have actually used that 30 billion and added more by provisioning for an extension of a COVID relief grant. So essentially, JEFRA use has almost been neutralized if you just look at the debt servicing costs. Yes, the reduction in the actual quantum of debt, that is positive. But the benefit that has been obtained from the lower debt service costs have been reversed, which is where, when Treasury talks about fiscal rules, that becomes another important element to make sure that in future we can lock in these benefits so that they cannot be reversed by spending that get crystallized. Unfortunately for now, if you look at the expenditure ceiling, it's not legislated. It can easily be pierced through. So it is a rule that does not actually provide a proper fiscal anchor. I think that's where we might need to see a lot more work being done to say, how do we put together fiscal rules that gets legislated so that the politics of the day cannot circumvent those rules in a way that protects the fiscal framework. I'm not sure if we are there yet or if we'll get there soon enough, but I think it's one element that is required to improve our management of the fiscus going forward.
Duncan, you reviewed macroeconomic policy for the past 15 years. The key reason here, and I suppose as well, what you believe has, how do we answer when it comes to macroeconomic policy and whether it's been able to deliver on its objectives based on that macroeconomic policy review you've done for 15 years? Well, looking back at the past 15 years, well, what were we trying to answer here in that document?
I'll answer that question shortly. Let me just also quickly respond to something that Isaah mentioned. The provisional allocation for the social relief of distress grant for the 2 outer years of the fiscal framework was already in the fiscal framework in the medium-term budget policy statement. That means that the 35 and 36 billion in the 2 outer years was already there. So it's not offsetting the savings from debt service costs. That's a new saving, which is why the budget balance improves over time and which is why the gross borrowing requirement actually comes down over time. So I think that's a very important point to make, is that when we talk about a 30 billion saving in debt service costs, that is post-JEFRA, whereas the pre-JEFRA fiscal framework already made provision for the social relief of distress. In terms of the macro review, what treasuries around the world typically do is that every few years they reflect back on macro policy, in particular fiscal and monetary policy, and they try to extract some of the lessons from that. We have several underlying papers, and we published an accessible version of that macro review yesterday on the website. And on the fiscal side, there are really 2 or 3 key issues that emerge from there. The one issue is that, and the minister talks about this very often, is the composition of our spending. The composition of our spending has not historically been balanced to support growth. What does that mean? The composition of our spending is tilted towards consumption spending as opposed to, which does have a positive impact on the economy in the short term, but capital spending has a lasting and durable impact on the economy over the long term. And so the key lesson is, how do you change the composition of your spending to have better growth outcomes? And that's why the minister also announced a range of reforms on the infrastructure side in the budget yesterday, including the revised PPP guidelines that we released for public comment this week. I think the other key message, which the minister touched on as well in his earlier remarks, is around how SOC bailouts have been crowding out expenditure for key social priorities, and we reflect on that, and that's why we are taking a much tougher stance, to Isaah's point at the beginning, towards state-owned companies, demanding real conditionality and reforms in exchange for any assistance. And then the final point, I think, that emerges from the fiscal side is the way in which rising debt service costs have started to crowd out important social expenditure, and why it's so important for us to get fiscal sustainability right, because that's how you actually support development. Because if your finances are sustainable, you have more resources available, and instead of spending it on debt service costs, you can direct it to important social and other priorities.
Minister, let's talk about the state-owned entities, and I'm going to then take that as my last question, or pause it. And the reason I want to do that is that there's a lot of questions coming through from the online side, and I can imagine it's no different from the people who are in the room who want to ask you questions. And also I want to mention that we've got about 45 minutes with you because everybody wants a piece of you now that, you know, the budget has been delivered. So we want to allow other people and also allow you to be able to do the duties for the rest of the day. But let's talk about the SOE. So you make mention of, you know, Eskom continuing its recovery plan. You talk a little bit about Transnet. What is Denel struggling with here when it comes to its turnaround strategy?
Denel has got a challenge we don't know. We don't know. That DG is strict. It's not me. It's that DG is strict. We gave Denel 3.5 billion rand. They had not met a couple of other conditions. We're going towards the end of the financial year. Precisely because of that, they've not been able to access the full 3.5 billion. Because that DG wants the conditions to be fulfilled before you can transfer the remaining $1 billion. We will be meeting them. There were other conditions which we attached, which were beyond their control, because defense took a view which opposed them on that point, and then we said, okay, on these conditions, we will relieve of these conditions, but continue with the rest. So we still have a problem with Denel, but they have got a turnaround strategy. We want to check. We're arranging a meeting with them before the end of the financial year to check what the challenges are. But so far, they're quiet than others.
DG, apparently you're strict. So now I want to know, how strict are you when it comes to, you know, the conditions for Transnet?
He spends most of his time in Transnet these days.
Look, I think the minister covered it very well yesterday in the press conference when he said that Transnet has a turnaround plan which was developed by Transnet, which is aligned to the National Freight Logistics Roadmap. Our responsibility is to support Transnet in executing that turnaround plan. What we've done is we've given them some help in the form of a 47 billion rand guarantee in order to assist them to manage any liquidity challenges that they might have in the short term as they execute this turnaround plan of theirs. So our job is to support them, and we believe that if they execute their turnaround plan, then they can get back to being a sustainable entity. But it's going to be a very difficult, I think, 6 to 12 months for Transnet as they make progress on the various initiatives that they've committed to in order to get that done. We have to ensure, and this is a call that's come from Parliament quite vociferously, which is to the extent that you are binding the fiscus in the form of the guarantees that you issue, you have a responsibility, including in your reporting to us, to demonstrate that those funds are A, not being at risk of being called, and B, are leading to the right kind of outcomes. So there is a measure of strictness that comes with committing the fiscal framework in the way that we do.
All right. So this is the part where you get to ask the questions, and we're going to have mics moving around. So the one request that has come forward is that for those of you who are going to ask questions in the room with us, if you can please stand up and just state your name, and if you can keep those questions as short and to the point as possible, just to give enough people in the panel to answer questions, including the minister himself. So if we have any questions, you can raise your hand, and we'll try and get a mic over to you. In the meantime, while we do that, there is a question that's come through online. There's quite a lot of them, so I'm going to try my very best to get through to them. The first question reads here, the budget mentions infrastructure development through public-private partnerships. And the question says, what is National Treasury going to do to capacitate departments to have shorter turnaround times when it comes to those partnerships and making this work? So, Minister, do you want to answer that one?
Let me just give it a crack, but DG, I think, will come in on it. You know, one of the problems in government, you will see down the line, we're talking about avoiding duplications and so on. There's too much duplication. The starting point is how to make sure that you streamline. There's also too much competition between different departments. There's also within the departments an attitude that we can't release. We want to do things on our own. Let me just give you an example. We agreed that we are going to do student accommodation as a blended finance, and we put money into the DBSA for that purpose. Earlier, we were doing some work, and then the Department of Higher Education said, no, we want you to do it differently. So the first thing is to institutionalize that process so that there should be no dispute in government. I was saying, for instance, the president says to me, set 100 billion rand in infrastructure fund. I said, okay, by all means, Mr. President, 100 billion rand, but what am I going to fund? Because departments want the money to go into their own department. So the first thing we need to do, Mr. President, is to institutionalize that one, streamlining how infrastructure is being managed and funded. But do you want to take a crack, did you? Because you've been...
Yeah, no, Minister, I think you've covered it well. The only other point I would make is that in addition to the point that we need to clarify the roles, I think we do also have a responsibility to assist the implementing agencies, whether it's municipalities or departments, with the capacity to produce better pipelines, because that is our challenge, and that's the key concern that the Minister brought to us when he arrived at the Treasury, which is we can solve the financing challenges on our side, but what we cannot solve on behalf of departments is the actual pipeline of infrastructure projects. And so part of the reforms that the Minister announced yesterday are about how do you also capacitate departments and municipalities in order to submit better quality projects, whether it's PPPs or other blended finance projects, so that the financing can flow and follow more easily.
Okay. We do have a question in the audience. I believe you have the mic.
Hi, good morning. It's Kim Silverman from Matrix. I just wanted to thank RMB Sunday Times for this fantastic event. I wanted to pick up on what Isaah was saying in terms of the strictness that you maintain over your increase in spending. For example, in Denel, there was a continued payout to Denel, even though they haven't, or bailout to Denel, even though they haven't produced financial statements for, I think, the last 3 years, which was you put in the budget. So I think maybe those are examples where Treasury can put more of a condition in place, because I think when you have something concrete like that, it does allow you to be conditional if you haven't got a financial statement. So maybe you can just sort of address that. And also following on Isaah's point, I do think there's a slide towards us as the public accepting this idea that there's nothing one can do about increasing spending in an election year. And we tend to just accept that as a fact. And I do think we need to start fighting back, because we don't need to increase spending in an election year. That is a political choice, which, and you as a politician will know a lot more about that than I do. But I do think we need to start questioning why we just accept that as the status quo. Then just, sorry, a technical question. Will National Treasury pay repo rate on the JEFRA?
Yeah, let me just deal with the election issue. You can take the Denel financials and the report. I think I made it absolutely clear that we have not agreed that we should increase budgets because it was an election year. I made that absolutely clear that this is not an election budget. If there's going to be any election budget, it was supposed to be 23-24, if any. Like you, I don't buy the story that people have got to have given a mandate for 5 years. They only decide to implement it during the last year of the administration. I can't understand that. And therefore, we've got to spend more money on the last day of the administration. When we are given a mandate for 5 years, my sense is that you've got to start implementing the mandate from the first year so that there is no requirement for you to start looking for resources to spend recklessly and in most cases, when that happens, it's not even spent efficiently when that money happens because there's too much rush to spend. But did you?
Thanks, Minister. On the last question, the contingency reserve of 100 billion that we are paying back to the Reserve Bank through the JEFRA Defrayal Act that the Minister tabled yesterday is the mechanism that the Reserve Bank will use to sterilize the JEFRA disbursements. So, and they will have to sterilize the JEFRA disbursements at the repo rate, but they are doing, so yes, but they are doing that via the interest that they pay on the excess reserves that the banks hold to them. So yes, the JEFRA disbursements are being sterilized at the repo rate, but by the Reserve Bank via the contingency reserve mechanism and through the excess rate, interest rate, excess reserves interest rate that they pay to banks. So that's the mechanism by which the reserves are being sterilized. The first question on Denel, look, I think the Minister made the point earlier that there was an allocation to Denel this year, and they have not received all of that allocation. They've only received about half of it. And part of the reason is because there are conditions that they were supposed to meet that they have not yet met. And we typically include a range of conditions with these kinds of allocations. Some of them are sort of financial and administrative, and some of them are more operational and about transforming the business. It is difficult to insert specific conditions around the tabling or the finalization of annual financial statements for an entity that is in technical default, but that is something that we are trying to strengthen through the sort of more financial conditions that we impose when we have. We report on the conditions for all entities every quarter to Parliament. So those conditions are published. We did a report to Parliament 2 weeks ago where we went through all the SOC conditions, where one can see what those conditions are and how the SOCs have performed against each of those conditions.
Okay, we're just going to get a mic to the lady in... Okay, cool. And then we'll get a mic to that lady.
Good morning. My name is Mielan Holeni. I'm from DISO Consulting Group. And my question is still on the JEFRA. Seeing that, in one of the fora that you were addressing, Minister, last night, you correctly diagnosed the problem of the economy as being the problem of lack of growth. And I must add, I may be the only person who clapped in the room, to the surprise of many people. But isn't the fact that, we have this marvelous fund, which in one of the sightings or the papers that was put out, it says that, and I quote, "We show that South Africa is an outlier by international standards, having accumulated close to 8% of GDP in positive central bank equity." Seeing that we have this crisis, and the fact that, the budget that successively have been put out have been dealing with mainly social issues. And of course, you know, you budget, you get what you budget for. You've never budgeted for growth. Isn't perhaps, you know, a fund like this, perhaps, you know, a sovereign fund of sorts that should be purposed in some ways to start aggressively creating growth conditions and at least, you know, forward-looking as opposed to the current budget that we have, which is almost, you know, dealing with the immediate issues. Isn't this perhaps, you know, a silver bullet or the luck that you were talking about, you know, that is presented to you to be able to turn around the lack of growth and subsequently the poor revenue within the economy?
Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, let me just say, I mean, if I understand, the centrality of the argument is why can't we utilize the funds to create a sovereign wealth fund? My understanding, except 2 countries, the countries that have gone into creating sovereign wealth fund have had an advantage of commodities that have helped them to create a surplus in the economy and therefore created sovereign wealth fund. There are 2 countries that have done it from the Fiscal, I think, if I remember well, is Singapore and somebody else. But we don't have a surplus of any kind, which we can put in out there as a result. My understanding, a sovereign wealth fund arises precisely because they've got surplus funds. You can start packing and create a sovereign wealth fund. We don't have that. That's, yeah.
There are 2 questions here. I'm going to split them between Isaah and Itireleng. Isaah, the first question here reads, your sense of government's ability to balance social welfare spending with fiscal sustainability. And Itireleng, perhaps you can take this one. When it comes to, I just might have lost it there, but there we go. Transparency and accountability in public finances, your sense of the measures that have been taken on that front. So those are the 2 questions that we have out there for you. Isaah, do you want to take that one while we get a mic? Okay, you do have the mic.
I think if we look since the global financial crisis, we have always crystallized social spending in the budget. We have not been able to spend on productive capital. And as a result, we ended up having to borrow more in order to finance that increased spending to a large extent on SOE bailouts and salaries and wages. And in response to the rising debt and the need to do some sort of consolidation, there have been reductions in capital spending of many departments, which invariably resulted in lack of investments, whether be it in roads, rail, because we have been trying to consolidate, but we use CapEx as a method to consolidate and not necessarily current spending. That's what you see if you look in the budget numbers. 60% of our budget is social spending. There is very little that you could do to reduce that because it's very sticky, politically difficult to the minister's point, which then leaves lifting economic growth the only way that can provide a durable way to raise tax revenues and reduce your debt to GDP ratio, which doesn't come quickly enough.
Itireleng, the question that was asked around transparency and accountability in public finances.
So what it comes down to, Anastasia, is trust. And that's really what people are looking out for. And hence the question around transparency. And as long as people are feeling that there isn't enough that is being put out there, that anything is being withheld, and this is what it starts to destroy, right, the trust. And is there enough transparency? There probably could be more. I think more work can be done. There is an opportunity for that. And I think more can be done. I don't think it's enough. I think the work that's currently being done is great, it's fantastic, but we can definitely do more for that exposure and that transparency around that, because this is the money that the public is giving in, and would like to know what is happening with it and how is it being spent.
Okay. We had a question from...
Sorry, just a bit on this transparency thing. Is it because the information we publish is not accessible, or let me just say there's a lot of, I mean, I find it strange even in Parliament. Parliament, no matter members of Parliament come to us in Treasury instead of dealing with the departments that are not performing. And we publish, for instance, every quarter Section 32 reports, which says how people are spending the money. The Section 32 reports, where how people are spending the money in the budget review, we reveal everything that is there. I find it strange, even members of Parliament, I'm just saying, is a problem transparency, or is there something else? As I've indicated, we publish Section 32 reports every month and say how people are spending, and members of Parliament come to Treasury and say, why are you not doing this? Why are you not doing this? Why are you squeezing this department? Where in fact the department is underspending. I'm just saying this, something, whereas in the what is that institution which published transparency, budget transparency, where probably we sometimes become number 1 or number 2 or number 3, we've never been told of that in terms of transparency. So I'm saying there's some challenges in Itireleng.
And maybe I was just going to add, maybe the other side of looking at it, or a different way of looking at it, is maybe the accountability.
Yeah.
So maybe there is transparency, but are we holding...
Precisely.
So maybe that is the real issue. That's
the real issue.
Thank you. My name is Masi Abi Marageni from Future Growth Asset Management. Minister, there was a new long-term fiscal anchor that was proposed in the budget. And if we look at the current fiscal anchor, it's basically centered around maintaining a budget surplus, right? In order to actually...
A primary surplus.
Yeah, sorry, the primary surplus, in order to stabilize the debt burden. Could you please give us more detail around this new proposed long-term fiscal plan?
The first thing I indicated in my earlier remark that what we needed to do is to stabilize debt from 75.3% of GDP downwards. But to achieve that, you've got to start building a buffer via the primary surplus and make sure that you always revenue is higher than non-interest spending. That's how you're going to build that buffer and build that primary surplus over time. So I don't know when I'm explaining actually, yeah. So that's the purpose we're trying to achieve. The issue Isaah is raising is how sustainable is that if there's no rule? Which I think that was your point. You said we understand you guys, but in the absence of a rule, this thing can be breached. You had an expenditure ceiling at some point, and you never followed it because there were no rules. That's the tricky point. You will see in the budget review. We're then we're entering into a process of engagement, because part of the difficulty is to think that you can set rules when people have not internalized these rules, and they become a treasury rules than a society rules.
There is a question that's come through online, and there are actually 2 questions, but I'm going to try and make them into one question in the interest of time. The question says, how is the government addressing challenges such as unemployment and poverty, but also at the same time dealing with the issues of, inclusive growth and inequality?
Well, those are difficult questions. Particularly inclusivity. What do you mean? I mean, what to accept, I said, part of the difficulty we've had, if you look at the period between 1994 and now, 1994, there were 9 million people employed in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. As we sit, we're sitting at about 16 million people. But the population is growing faster than economic growth, and particularly over the last decade. What that means, the capacity of the economy to absorb people into jobs has become limited. What we need to do then is what we're talking about, how do we address the structural constraints that have been strangling growth over the years? Now, it's not helping somebody who's unemployed that. So what you need to say, while we are dealing with these structural concerns and to improve growth, we need to cushion the impact on those that are unemployed. That's why then you have to have a tilt towards social spending. My view is that it should be a temporary measure which cushions the impact while you are generating employment. It should not on its own be a permanent feature of our society.
Isaah, how are you viewing it?
Look, I think there's no other way to correctly view it. As a temporary measure, I think it makes sense. The other way to interpret it is, it's the price we pay for stability.
Okay.
That's how you can view social spending. Because the scenes of July 2021 can become frequent if that is not provided for. But it cannot be a permanent feature of the fiscal. The economy must be able to generate jobs so people can actually sustain themselves without having to depend on the state. But how quickly the economy can do that, that's what we have seen. It's taking far too long, such that the burden of social spending now is making it impossible to invest in the infrastructure that can actually absorb people into jobs.
Questions from the floor?
There's one there.
Okay, while we get the mic over to that gentleman over there, there was a question around Transnet, but we already dealt with the Transnet issue, and that's an online question. So there should be a playback facility at the end of the event. So if you missed that answer when it comes to Transnet and everything that's happened, and also the mention from Treasury that they are going to be having a meeting with Transnet, etc. So that's been dealt with, just to address that particular question that's come through. The gentleman on the floor.
Thanks. My name is Ndobeko from All Weather Capital. Maybe slightly unrelated to the budget, but I'll find the connection. So I think we talked a little bit about the budget being crowded out by spending. 60% of it just goes to consumption spending, and that's crowding out investments that we need as a country. We're talking about high employment rate, and population growing faster than we are able to create jobs. So this brings me then to the question of us having put legislation forth that actually externalized savings through Reg 28 with 45% allocation. It's probably a question you get a lot, but I'll put it up again. Is that we have actually shot ourselves in the foot by doing that. We need more savings invested in our country to fund these infrastructure projects, to get our economy to grow at a faster pace than the population is growing so that we can create real jobs. But we've taken our money and given it to foreigners where actually there's no reciprocal benefit to us. That money is managed by offshore companies, being invested in their own countries for their own infrastructure needs or whatever. And here we are sitting and moaning and complaining that we actually need funding. So is there any thoughts from Treasury to actually reverse this policy? Because it's actually hurting even the asset management industry. It's shrinking. The JSE companies that are listed are shrinking. Companies are looking to externalize to find new sources of capital, because what we have as a pool of savings is actually is not enough, because we've decided to export it.
So what you're missing, sir, is this interaction between the minister and the GG, because one of them needs to answer the question, and it's all about who can take it. So I don't know. I'm going to give it to the one with the biggest smile. Let's give it to the minister.
Let me just say I think we are agreed that it was a grave mistake. If you ask me, it was a grave mistake. But the question is it easy to undo? The answer is no, unless you can give me an appropriate answer, or is there people who are working with. We're debating, in Treasury, there's a lot of disagreement on it. He was not a DG at the time when the decision was taken. I'm guilty because my signature is attached to it. That's why when I say, can you take the question, he says, you. Because I signed. Look, I accept, in my view, it was a grave mistake. The question is reversing it an easy thing to do without serious implications for it? There's an interesting thing in Treasury. We have got divisions. There's the asset and liability, there's the group, which is the financial policy grouping, which include the tax policy guys. They've got different views. We tend to be more democratic in Treasury, not impose views on people, to take them along. They've got different views. They think that there are different methods you can achieve the same objective without reversing the rule, without reversing it. You can manage it without reversing. So we've had a discussion about it. I don't think now there's a firm view to reverse the rules, except I'm saying this with caution. If my DM was here, he'd probably jump from my throat. So he's also chair of PIC, so he belongs to, can you see factions and treasures? He asked the questions to me. If I were to allow PIC to take 45% out of this economy, what would happen to the JSE?
Can I perhaps try to make the minister feel bad?
Yeah.
No, I'm just joking. I want to make you feel better for the decision you made. There are different ways to look at the 45% offshore allowance. If you are a pension fund contributor, you are employed, you contribute to a pension fund, returns in the domestic economy has been low because economic growth has been low. If you just use growth as a proxy for returns has been low relative to our peer emerging economies, relative to advanced economies. But then if you also look at the second aspect of the JSE, we have been seeing a decreasing number of listed companies, which is not a unique phenomenon to South Africa, which means the market is highly concentrated. Investment opportunities in the listed market have shrunk. But for the pension fund member that is contributing for retirement, you need to maximize returns, which are low domestically, but better in other emerging markets and advanced economies. So from a member perspective, it makes sense to say, diversify your investments into markets that can give you a better return. That's a logical decision to make. The one way that you can reverse it without actually changing the piece of legislation is to improve the ability of the economy to generate growth because it's an asset allocation decision. You choose where to deploy capital because you want to maximize return in a particular asset class. So if the South African economy generates enough growth, an asset manager is going to take that money back and bring it into the South African economy because they can generate returns in the domestic economy. So the solution lies in the infrastructure issues that we're talking about. Solve those, lift economic growth, the money will come back.
But if you follow the logic of that gentleman, which I'm sympathetic to, is that even investment, growth is a function of investment. Investment is a function of savings.
Yeah.
Of savings. If at a macro level, I can see from an individual perspective, but at a macro level, if your savings are flowing out, they're not stimulating investment in your own economy. Yeah. I think that's where his argument is. So we've got to balance that individual thing and the macro perspective of making sure there's sufficient savings for investment in the economy.
Agreed, Minister.
Yeah.
Investments follow growth.
Yeah.
So wherever, wherever an economy is growing fast enough, investments will come. And we see it if you look in some of the countries in the East African countries that are growing 6-7%. They do have the ability to attract investments. Yes, there are other aspects that matters, the institutional framework, deep capital markets, all of those things matter. But as long as you don't have growth, investments is not going to come.
But in those economies, even the savings are managed.
True.
Okay, so we've got about 8 minutes. Minister, as I mentioned to the audience, not just here but online, is that you do have other engagements where we would like you to make it on time as well. So we've got about 8 minutes with you.
Yeah, I'm going to do what Itireleng is saying,
Which
is
is?
absence. I'm going to go and account now to the joint standing committee.
Excellent. Okay, so based on everything that we've discussed here and some of the notes that we've shared, there are other questions that I would have loved to pose to you, but unfortunately, in the interest of time, we don't have the time to get through all of them. At the end of this event, what is one or two key things you want people to be able to walk away with, not just in this room, but the people out there who are watching you right now, responding to some of the questions? What is the one thing or two things that you want them to remember about this budget that you've delivered?
Look, the first thing is to acknowledge that we have got challenges. Again, I'm not going to make this thing. The government has got to take the responsibility for some of these challenges. First and foremost, I want to make that upfront. If you ask me, I can't say I'm happy with the fact that we've not been able to deal with the electricity challenge for 16 years. Right? That we must admit is a fundamental flaw in our dealing with the electricity challenges, so which has cost the economy substantially. First thing is to acknowledge that we've had a problem and we're having a problem. The second thing we must acknowledge is that there's a general realization by a couple of South Africans that we need to work together to address these challenges. For instance, a number of business people have come forward, the Business Association, and bringing in talent, working with government on what is called NECOM to address the electricity challenges. Building on that template, business has come forward, working with government, and develop what is called now on the road logistic roadmap. Now, what does that mean? I'm saying there are challenges. It impacts negatively on the budget and all of these things I've said. What does that mean? What that means is that we need as South Africans to take a view, and even as government, not to be arrogant and accept solutions from different people across the board, that these challenges need to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Again, even on crime, we've brought in business to work with us and how we can deal with crime. There are strategies that are being developed, which include even the private security people and so on, and working together to solve this problem. So my take is that we've got problems that are impacting negatively on the budget, which I said the point our strategy for a tax strategy is to broaden the base than increasing taxes.
Yeah.
Is to broaden the base than increasing taxes. If you look at you compare us to our peers, tax to GDP, we're not comparing favorably.
Yeah.
So what that means is we should not be working hard to say how should we tax people more. We should be saying how do we broaden that tax base. There are a number of ways of doing it. First, the fundamental is to grow the economy, but we can only grow the economy if we bring all of us these solutions and try and change I think we can do it.
Okay.
Working together.
You still giving yourself an 8 out of 10? Well, the team an 8 out of 10?
No, I think I'm saying from an economic perspective, we must a different, but from crafting a budget in the current environment. In the current environment, weak economic growth, logistic challenges where you're not getting revenues from your major taxpayers, the mining industries, we did the best we could.
Okay.
And I think in that environment, no one predicted that we could achieve what we did.
Okay.
In that environment, I think even Itireleng can change.
He still hasn't given me a figure, but I'll come back with Isaah, one thing we should take away from this budget.
Difficult conditions, but I think in the confines of a lot of those challenges, it's a decent budget.
Still a 7?
I could add one more.
Itireleng, the pressure is on.
I can feel it. So in terms of my takeaway, I'm a very big fan of taking responsibility. So to the minister's point, as we cannot expect the state to do everything. Some way, somehow, we all have to play our part and take responsibility and step in as well, because it's not going to happen and nothing is going to change if we're all just looking in one direction and expecting some major changes to come there. And I really love what the minister said yesterday, and this is to quote what he said, and he said it would be easy to indulge in extremes, either of blind optimism or crippling pessimism. We should resist both the extremes. I thought that it was perfect, and hence his budget was really given with what he had to deal with. Even though, like I said at the beginning, I wanted more and expect more. We're looking for growth. We're looking for more revenue collections, so we can make the necessary changes that are required for our country. So I will add a half.
She gave us a whole quote.
Oh, unquote, yes.
Okay, 6.5.
Yeah. I moved up.
Minister, thank you so much for your time, including yourself, Isaah, Itireleng, and of course, DG. I would have loved to have you here, but it was even better over there. So thank you so much for answering and fielding some of those questions that have come through. What's lovely about these engagements is that we're going to have them as often as possible, because it's all about talking and exchanging and sharing ideas, because as Isaah said, investments follow growth. And we need to be able to work together in driving that growth so we can come back here and have a different story to tell that is better, not just for ourselves in the room, but for investors and for those who are actually watching us. So, Minister, thank you so much for your time. I think I'll give you that 8, I think. Thank you so much for those of you who are tuning in online, and for the audience in the room. The panelists will be around if you want to engage even further. So thank you so much.